Two teams, two ends, 533 meters of solid rock between them, no GPS, no blueprints, no modern surveying equipment. Only oil lamps flickering in the dark iron chisels driven into limestone by hands that could not see the men working toward them from the other side. Above them, the city was still breathing. Below them, the ground was being hollowed out one strike at a time. And somewhere in the distance, on the roads leading north through the hill country of Judah, the dust was already rising. The Assyrians were coming. What happened beneath Jerusalem over 2,700 years ago was not supposed to survive. The workers were anonymous. The planning was desperate. The pressure was extreme. And yet the tunnel is still there. The water still flows. And carved into the stone wall near the far end, an inscription, likely connected to the workers and the project itself, still records the moment the two teams finally heard each other through the rock and knew they were going to make it. This is the story of Hezekiah's Tunnel, a story of engineering, survival, faith, and one of the most remarkable feats of the ancient world, hidden beneath the streets of Jerusalem for nearly 3 millennia. But before we go underground, we need to understand why the tunnel existed at all. And for that, we need to understand the world that made it necessary. The 8th century before Christ was a century of fire. Empires rose and devoured smaller nations whole. Armies marched with terrifying organization. Kings built their reputations on the ashes of cities that had refused to submit, and at the center of all of it, at the height of its power, was Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was not simply a military force. It was a machine, political, logistical, psychological, and brutal in ways that were deliberate and calculated. The Assyrians understood that terror was a weapon. They used it systematically. When a city resisted, the consequences were meant to be remembered by every city that came after. Populations were deported, rulers were humiliated, identity was erased. The empire did not just conquer, it dismantled. By the late 8th century, the Assyrian army had moved through the ancient Near East like a force of nature. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen. In 722 BCE, the city of Samaria was taken by the Assyrian king Sargon II. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were carried into exile, scattered across the empire, and the region was resettled with foreign peoples. What had been Israel was gone. The small southern kingdom of Judah watched all of this from a distance that was shrinking every year. Jerusalem sat in the hill country, a city of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 people at the time, protected by its elevation and its walls, but exposed in ways that its inhabitants understood all too well. When Hezekiah became king, he inherited a city surrounded by growing Assyrian influence, with a tribute relationship to the empire that kept the peace at a price. And Hezekiah was not content to maintain that arrangement forever. 2 Kings chapter 18 tells us that Hezekiah did what was right in the eyes of God. He removed the high places where foreign gods were worshipped. He broke down the sacred pillars. He cut down the Asherah pole. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, in a way that set him apart from nearly every other king of Judah before or after him. The text describes him as someone who held fast to God and did not turn away. But faith and politics do not exist in separate worlds, and the political world Hezekiah navigated was moving toward a confrontation he could not avoid. At some point during his reign, Hezekiah made the decision to stop paying tribute to Assyria. This was not a passive act. It was a declaration. It was the kind of move that invited a response. And in the world of ancient Near Eastern empires, that response would not be diplomatic. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 tells us that when Hezekiah saw that the Assyrian king Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he took counsel with his officials and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city. The text says the officials helped him. The decision was made, and the project began. But to understand what that decision meant, what it cost, what it required, and why it mattered, you need to understand one thing about Jerusalem that shaped everything. The city had a water problem. Jerusalem sits on a ridge. It is not built near a river. It has no natural lake. The primary water source for the ancient city was a spring located in the Kidron Valley, just outside the eastern wall. This spring, known as the Gihon Spring, had provided water for Jerusalem since before the time of David. It was, in every practical sense, the reason the city could exist at all in that location. But the Gihon Spring was outside the city walls. In peacetime, this was manageable. Water could be channeled through surface conduits and open trenches. Life went on. But in wartime, in siege warfare, a water source outside the walls was not an asset. It was a liability. A besieging army could cut off the water. They could contaminate it. They could control it and use it to break the city from the outside without ever breaching a single gate. Hezekiah understood this, and he understood something else. If Sennacherib was coming, and all the evidence suggested that he was, Jerusalem's survival might depend on water as much as on walls. The plan that emerged was audacious. Block the external water sources so that an invading army could not use them. Redirect the Gihon Spring through a tunnel carved beneath the city. Deliver that water to a reservoir inside the walls, a pool known later as the Pool of Siloam, where it could sustain the population through a siege without the enemy ever touching it. Simple in concept, staggering in execution. The limestone ridge beneath Jerusalem is not soft earth. It is hard, ancient rock, the kind of stone that resists every tool and demands patience that the urgency of the situation would not easily allow. And yet the plan was to carve a channel through that rock for over 500 meters. From the Gihon Spring on the east side of the city to the Pool of Siloam in the southwestern quadrant, and they would do it from both ends simultaneously. This is the part of the story that engineers and archaeologists still find remarkable. Digging a tunnel from one end is difficult enough. Digging from two ends at the same time, through solid limestone, without modern instruments, and having both teams eventually meet in the middle, that is something else entirely. Think about what the workers faced. Each team entered the rock from their respective end. They could not see each other. They had no reliable way to measure the precise distance between them, or the exact angle they needed to maintain to converge. They worked by lamplight in passages barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Limestone dust filled the air. The sound of chisels echoing off stone walls would have made it difficult to communicate, let alone navigate. And yet they had to find each other. Archaeologists who have studied the tunnel have noted that the path it takes is not a straight line. It curves. It bends in unexpected ways. And near the point where the two teams eventually met, there is visible evidence of course correction. Places where the passage shifts, where one team clearly adjusted direction in response to something they detected. What were they following? Some scholars believe the workers may have used the natural fractures and fissures already present in the limestone, following existing lines of weakness in the rock rather than cutting blind through solid stone. These natural cracks would have served as guides, reducing the labor required and helping both teams move in roughly compatible directions. Others suggest the workers may have used the sound of water, the Gihon Spring itself producing audible movement through the rock, as an acoustic reference point. It is also possible that at some stage of the dig, when the teams were close enough, they may have been able to hear each other's hammer blows through the remaining stone, guiding their final approach. We do not know exactly how they did it. What we know is that they succeeded. And an inscription near the tunnel's southern end describes the breakthrough moment with a kind of raw excitement that no engineering manual ever could. But before we reach that inscription, we need to pause and sit with what was happening above ground while this work was being done below. The Assyrian threat was not theoretical. It was advancing. Sennacherib became king of Assyria around 705 BCE. When subject nations took the opportunity of a new king's accession to reassert independence or rebel, Sennacherib did what Assyrian kings did. He mobilized his army. His campaign against Judah is documented in several surviving royal inscriptions, clay prisms covered in cuneiform text, written in the self-aggrandizing language of empire. Among the best known are the Taylor Prism, now housed in the British Museum, and a closely related prism in the Oriental Institute in Chicago. These records were designed as propaganda, crafted to celebrate Sennacherib's power and project his invincibility across the ancient world. According to his own records, Sennacherib swept into Judah. He describes attacking and capturing 46 walled cities of Hezekiah's kingdom. The language is proud, detailed, and intended to demonstrate the total dominance of the empire. Siege ramps, battering rams, deportations, all of it recorded in careful, boastful detail. But then something interesting happens in those inscriptions. When Sennacherib reaches Jerusalem, his account shifts. He does not say he captured the city. The royal propaganda, that same language that boasts of taking 46 cities, describes shutting Hezekiah up inside Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. He claims tribute was imposed. He says gifts were later sent to Nineveh, but nowhere in these surviving records does Sennacherib claim to have breached Jerusalem's walls, removed Hezekiah from power, or taken the city. This is significant. Assyrian royal inscriptions were documents of victory. Kings did not typically record their failures in stone. The conspicuous absence of a conquest claim over Jerusalem in inscriptions that boast extensively about everything else, is itself a kind of historical evidence. Something went wrong for the Assyrians at Jerusalem. Something stopped them. But we are getting ahead of the story, because when Sennacherib's forces arrived in Judah and the campaign reached its full scale, the tunnel beneath Jerusalem was not yet the focus of the narrative. The king was preparing for a siege on every front. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 describes the scope of Hezekiah's preparations. He stopped up all the springs in the stream that flowed through the land, saying, "Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water?" He worked hard to repair all the broken sections of the wall. He built towers. He constructed another wall outside. He made large numbers of weapons and shields. He appointed military commanders and assembled the people in the city square. This is not the portrait of a king sitting passively and waiting for God to act. This is a man preparing with everything he had, and yet the preparations existed within a frame of faith. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 also records that Hezekiah prayed, that he and the prophet Isaiah cried out to heaven when the Assyrian threat reached its peak. The book of 2 Kings records in striking detail what Hezekiah did when Sennacherib's field commander, the Rabshakeh, delivered a public speech outside Jerusalem's walls, mocking the city, mocking its God, and trying to convince people inside to abandon their king and surrender. Hezekiah's response, according to 2 Kings chapter 19, was to go to the temple, spread the Assyrian letters out before God, and pray. The prayer recorded there is remarkable for its honesty. Hezekiah does not pretend the threat is small. He acknowledges that Assyria had, in fact, destroyed many nations. He does not minimize the power of the empire. He simply asks God to act, not for the sake of human pride, but so that all the kingdoms of the earth would know who Israel's God truly was. That prayer and the answer that came through Isaiah stands at the heart of the story. But we are not quite there yet. We still need to go back underground. At some point during the weeks or months of the tunnel project, something happened that the workers apparently never forgot. They were close. Both teams had been cutting through limestone, following the rock, correcting their course, navigating in the dark for what must have felt like an eternity. And then one team heard the other. Not a word, not a message, just the faint, unmistakable sound of hammering through stone, coming from the direction they needed to go. The Siloam Inscription, discovered in 1880 by a young boy wading in the water inside the tunnel near its southern end, describes this moment with striking immediacy. The inscription is carved in ancient Hebrew script directly into the tunnel wall, one of the oldest examples of extended Hebrew writing ever found. Scholars have worked carefully to reconstruct the surviving text. It describes the day of the breakthrough. When the workers raised their picks toward each other, 3 cubits still separated them. There was heard the voice of a man calling to his fellow, and when the 2 ends were struck simultaneously, the water flowed from the spring to the pool. The inscription does not tell us who commissioned the tunnel, how long it took, or how many workers were involved. It records the breakthrough moment, the instant the 2 halves of the passage finally became one. It is not a royal monument. It reads like something written in the immediate aftermath of an extraordinary event by people who had lived through it. The inscription was removed from the tunnel wall in 1880, taken to Istanbul, and is now housed in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. The tunnel itself remains in Jerusalem, still walkable, still carrying water through portions of its 533-meter length, still bearing the chisel marks of the men who cut it, with iron tools and lamplight, and the urgency of a nation that could not afford to fail. When the water began to flow from the Gihon spring through the completed tunnel and emerged at the pool of Siloam inside the city walls, something fundamental about Jerusalem's defensive position had changed. The city could now be besieged without losing access to water. The external springs had been blocked or diverted. An Assyrian army could surround the walls, cut off supply lines, and attempt to starve or intimidate the population, but it could not deny them water. This mattered. In ancient siege warfare, water was often the deciding factor. Cities that held out for months or years typically had internal water. Cities that ran dry fell quickly. Hezekiah had addressed the problem that could not be solved with walls or weapons alone. And then Sennacherib came. The biblical account in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19, broadly consistent with the Assyrian records themselves, describes a campaign of devastating scope. Sennacherib's army moved through Judah. City after city fell. The major Judean fortress city of Lachish was besieged and taken, We know this not only from scripture but from the famous Lachish reliefs, carved stone panels that Sennacherib had installed in his palace at Nineveh, depicting the siege in extraordinary detail. The reliefs show Assyrian siege ramps, battering rams, and rows of captives being marched away. When the Rabshakeh arrived outside Jerusalem and delivered his address to the people on the wall, his words were carefully designed to shatter morale. He spoke loudly, in the language of the Judeans, so that the people on the walls could hear. He argued that no god of any nation had saved those nations from Assyria. He suggested that trusting in God or in Egyptian allies was foolishness. He offered the people of Jerusalem terms, surrender, and they would be taken to a land of grain and wine, not killed. 2 Kings chapter 18 tells us the people remained silent. They did not answer him a word, because the king had commanded them not to. Whatever fear those words produced inside Jerusalem, and it is difficult to imagine they produced anything else, the city held. And then Hezekiah went to the temple. He spread out the letters before God. He prayed with a directness that the text preserves in full, and the answer came through Isaiah. Isaiah's word to Hezekiah, recorded in 2 Kings chapter 19, was striking in its specificity. The Assyrian king would not enter the city. He would not shoot an arrow there. He would not build a siege ramp against it. He would return by the way he came. What followed is described in 2 Kings chapter 19 with a restraint that makes it more powerful rather than less. The text simply says that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the survivors woke in the morning, the bodies were there. Sennacherib broke camp and withdrew to Nineveh. The mechanisms behind this event are not described. Scripture does not explain the biology or the logistics. Ancient sources, including the Greek historian Herodotus, writing much later, record a tradition involving some kind of disaster that struck an Assyrian army in the region, though his account differs in detail from the biblical one. What the Assyrian royal inscriptions confirm is the one thing they conspicuously refuse to say. Jerusalem was not taken. The bird in the cage did not surrender. The cage held. 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 20 notes with quiet simplicity that the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, including all his achievements and how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city, are written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah. The tunnel is mentioned in Scripture almost as a footnote, one item in a summary of an extraordinary reign. But that footnote points to something that outlasted the king, outlasted the empire that tried to destroy him, and outlasted nearly every other physical artifact from that entire era. Today, visitors to Jerusalem can walk Hezekiah's tunnel. They enter near the Gihon spring, wade through water that in places rises to knee height, move through the low, narrow passage with its curved and uneven walls, and follow the route that those ancient workers cut through solid limestone when the empire was at the gates. The chisel marks are still visible. The curves and course corrections are still there. The passage still follows the same path it carved through the rock over 2,700 years ago. At the southern end, near where the Siloam Inscription was found, the tunnel opens into the light, and the water empties where the pool of Siloam once stood. Many scholars connect the tunnel with Hezekiah's preparations, drawing on the Siloam Inscription, the ancient Hebrew script, and analysis of the tunnel's construction. The physical evidence strongly supports a late 8th century context, consistent with the biblical account. But the tunnel does not prove the miracle. It proves the preparation, and that distinction matters. What the tunnel represents, what it still represents when you stand inside it in the dark, with the water moving around your feet and the stone pressing close on both sides, is the theology of preparation. Hezekiah did not choose between faith and action. He chose both. He blocked the springs, he reinforced the walls, he armed the soldiers, he rallied the people, he dug the tunnel. And when the moment came that no engineering could address, when the army was outside and the prayers were all that remained, he spread the letters before God and asked for what only God could give. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 records what Hezekiah said to his people during those days. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him. He was speaking to people who could hear the Assyrian army in the distance. He was speaking to people who had watched 46 of their cities fall, and he was telling them that the arithmetic of military power was not the only arithmetic that mattered. That kind of confidence is not the confidence of a man who ignored the threat. It is the confidence of a man who had done everything within his reach, and then placed the rest where it belonged. Beneath one of the most fought-over ancient cities on earth, the tunnel still carries water through the same rock it has always carried it through. The empires that surrounded Jerusalem in the 8th century before Christ exist now only in museum inscriptions and academic papers. But the water still moves through the rock, and somewhere in the dark beneath Jerusalem, the marks of anonymous hands in ancient stone still tell the story of men who cut through solid limestone, one hammer blow at a time, because someone above them believed that preparation and prayer were not opposites. They were partners.